Lou, the big surprise I had for you, I was going to ask you what was the most common ailment that the soldiers suffered from back in those days, and actually really the general public, was dysentery, which might actually sound embarrassing, but is quite deadly, because what happens? You lose all your liquids, and you die. And you have to, and I also mentioned before, medicine was medieval, and I mean that literally. Okay, now you all live in the 21st century, and we all complain about the cost of medicine, but the strides that were made only 20 years after the Civil War were pretty amazing, but the men really did suffer when they were sick, because they didn't have antibiotics, they didn't have penicillin, they didn't have aspirin, they did have something called opium, which we all know today, because from that you get morphine, and you get laudanum, and then of course heroin. And in fact, right after the Civil War, you had one of the big waves of drug addiction in the United States, because in those days you could purchase not only opium but cocaine right over the counter. So it was a time where they didn't also understand germs cause disease. So you had unsterilized water. You had surgeons who didn't know enough to wash their hands. In fact, they would work with dirty hands from patient to patient to patient. And they didn't think to wash. They didn't understand. And so what would happen? They would develop pus on all of these wounds. And they thought in those days pus was good. They called it laudable pus. And they thought, well, let's take this stuff and then spread it on the wounds of everybody else. So it's disgusting, but that was 1860s medicine. And then, actually, I'll pass this, well, you can come up with it later. We actually have some mini balls, the actual bullets. We made some pretty ghastly wounds because they were made of lead, 58 caliber. And the lead bullets, what they'll do is they actually heat up. And when they strike you, it's almost like putty. And we punch a wide wound, not just a clear wound. Say, for example, steel cartridge, steel cased bullets today, make a clean hole, almost sterilized. These would just shatter your limbs into pieces. So, what do they do in those days? What is the recourse? I mean, even today, when you have a shattered bone, amputation. So, you're in a hospital, which is a barn with animals all around, or you maybe be in a church, you'd be in an open field, you're on a dirty door, and they're operating, and they did have one small mercy in the 1860s. They did have something called chloroform. So there's a lot of stories about biting the bullet, which is extremely rare. They did knock out the men, and then they would saw off their limbs with dirty implements. And actually, the soldiers might actually survive the surgery, but everything that's been used has not been sterilized. So they'd be sent to the big hospitals back in Washington and get gangrene, which is where all the flesh just dies. You would just rot. And so the men, actually more men died from disease than they did from the wounds. 2/3 of the deaths were from disease. Yes?
Somewhere I heard that the North Bay accident, the stitching would boil stitches, and the person in the South, that was an advantage.
That was in the South, actually. They ran out of, in the South, okay, whatever we had to deal with, the South had it a lot worse because of the blockade. Mr. Lincoln's grand strategy, the Anaconda Plan, did a very good job strangling all the trade going into the South. So they had to be a little bit more inventive when it came to running out of things. Sutures. So some surgeon, I can't quote the source, said, okay, let's go use horsehairs. Horsehairs are nice and brittle, so you take horsehairs, but you have to boil them. So it was an accident that they found out by boiling these horsehairs. And suturing, they found out, well, there seems to be a lot less infection now. So, surprise. Yeah, a lot of strides in science. Penicillin was a big mistake. Well, unfortunately, I guess it didn't take long. Unfortunately, it really wasn't until 20 years later that sterilization really came into play with the store. So, it was a disgusting time. I hope we teach a lot of kids, and we always teach the kids to always wash their hands, after they use their bathroom, because these are the important lessons that we've all learned. All right. Any other questions? Because we'd like to move on to a weapon, because we want to make sure we teach you about that. Yes? Okay, save the best for last. So, did you want to speak a little about the weapon? Anyone? Mine's good.
Yeah, no, it's good. We have both.
Okay.
Okay.
That's the real one.
Yeah. So, the U.S. Army generally issued two makers of weapons. Springfield, out of Massachusetts, was the standard for the U.S. Army. When the 67th was first formed, we used an 1842 Springfield. So if you do the math, it's a 20-year-old weapon. They weren't rifle. It was smooth bore. It was 69 caliber. So it was a big ball, and it was exactly like the Revolutionary War, with the exception of it was a percussion instead of a flintlock. So they really hadn't made too much in the way of progress. Although by the time the war started and we were off and marching, we got 1861, which now had a rifle barrel. The difference between smooth bore and rifling is the same as a quarterback who can throw really well and throws a spiral, and one that can't, and it just kind of wobbles out there. Okay? I'm a Jet fan, so I know all about this. The other type of weapon was actually British manufacturer, Enfield. All right, so you can notice that they're roughly the same look and same design. They weren't interchangeable between the two of them. Enfield parts had to be replaced by, well, pretty much a whole new weapon because they still hadn't really worked out the whole interchangeable parts. But Springfield's were. So 61 Springfield.
I was just going to say, the difference between Max's Enfield and mine is that mine has the darker barrel. They realized that what was happening in the 1850s when these started coming out for the Crimean War, that the British were fighting with them, is that they were using high carbon content steel which rusted very easily. So they decided to blue the barrels in order to prevent the rust. But Civil War soldiers didn't like them like this. They liked them nice and shiny like the Springfield. So they'd actually polish the bluing off and have it look like Max's.
And of course, once it rains, anybody here ever eaten a cheese doodle? That's what these things look like.
And loading and firing these weapons is requires it's called nine steps of loading. And it might seem silly from your perspective, 21st century, but you always have to sort of put your mind back then. This was state of the art back in these days. Okay, so loading and firing. You're at attention right here. You would load. Musket goes right between your feet. You would handle the cartridge. That's when you would reach back to the cartridge box, where I have these cartridge tubes. All right, paper, 60 grains of black powder, and normally there would be a bullet at the end of it, one of the mini balls, lead, and you would tear the cartridge. You would pour powder down the barrel, and you just imagine that there is a lead bullet up at the top. And these bullets might be just a little bit irregular, but fortunately lead is soft. So it's up here at the top. This is where you would draw a rammer, like this, and you would ram the cartridge down to the bottom, and you'd have to make sure to return this rammer before you fire. Believe it or not, it'll be, during Civil War reenactments, we're banned from using this because some people might think, okay, I'm ready to go. And you'd have to return the rammer, and you always use Mr. Pinky to bring it down. Because what am I holding in my hand right now? It is a loaded weapon. And we Civil War reenactors, despite what you see in cartoons and TV shows, we actually take safety very seriously. And even though we only shoot blanks, which would just be the paper, that black powder gives off a flame about this high. And it's pretty spectacular when you see us fire at nighttime. I mean, you just see these red flames. And then you would prime. Okay, that's when it's going to step up a little closer to your feet like this. And comes over the cap pouch. You know, this is where the caps come out. And they're kind of small. And really the principle is no different than a cap gun. Well, you have to draw the hammer back to a half-cock position. Safety, it won't hit. It's only at full cock that the trigger will go off. But it's brass with fulminated mercury. And there's a cone. at the bottom of the camera. So when the cap goes on it, there's a hole drilled down that cone, which goes down to the bottom of the barrel, which is filled with powder. So once that hits, creates the spark, travels down, ignites the powder, and then like a football, the mini ball flies out. And of course, the last are ready, and then aim, and fire, bang, or sometimes click. Okay.
It's a lot of preparation.
It does, but they can go very fast. A good soldier can fire 3 rounds in a minute. I've seen 4 in a minute. I've seen somebody do 4
Do we
rounds.
roll that?
Well, really 3. I don't know anybody who's done 4 in
It's
1
on
minute.
YouTube. Go on YouTube.
Yeah. Yeah, there were actually contests within the hobby to see who could load and fire the fastest. Yes, in the back?
You mentioned about basically a misfire.
Yes.
What was your recourse?
Okay, that's good. Well, usually you could just take off the spent cap, put a fresh one on, and try to fire again. But if it doesn't, you could, usually what you do is...
Generally, most misfires were because of an accumulation of powder. You have a pick?
Yeah, actually do. So in my cartridge box. Yeah, the black powder, it's well, one of the components obviously is sulfur. So it gums up pretty quickly. And that's why it's so critical to maintain these weapons after you fire.
That cone that he was talking about, most soldiers had some version of these. The sergeants definitely did. That's the easiest recourse. Clear out that little chamber, make sure you can get a clean spark right down it. Black powder gums up really quickly. The Revolutionary War, they actually had 75 caliber weapons, but were using 69 caliber bullets because they knew by the end of the battle that barrel was going to get smaller and smaller and smaller as it got filled and filled and filled with the gun. The good thing about the mini ball is that as it came out of the barrel, it kind of took everything with it. It expanded to the size of the barrel and just kind of cleaned it as it went. You didn't really see that much in the Revolutionary War. It just gunked up and that was pretty much it. You were left with a full tube by the end. The next recourse would be just to take the weapon out of action and the sergeant would take it apart on the field. And then you'd have, his weapon would go to the person who was firing at that moment in time. Sergeants in the Civil War didn't really fire too much. They were kind of in the back and their responsibility was kind of keep an eye on the weapons and, yeah, check people's boxes, make sure everybody had ammunition. It's not like it's the really